Every inmate on death row at the Angola State Penitentiary asking Governor John Bel Edwards for a shortened sentence. The State Board of Pardons has to review the applications before the governor signs off on it. As Lester Duhay explains, it comes as some victims' families are disappointed that a life sentence would even be considered.
After 51 of the state's most notorious killers submitted applications to the Louisiana Board of Pardons Tuesday asking to change their punishment from the death penalty to life imprisonment without the chance of parole, the governor weighed in on the very topic he could have the final say on at the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge.
The Pardon Board is going to take those up, and I'm going to be very measured in what I say publicly, because I've never told an individual member of the Pardon Board or collectively what I would want them to do. I think they have to exercise their own judgment.
The governor has taken a firm stance against the death penalty recently, calling for lawmakers to abolish it back in April of this year. However, the few efforts to do that didn't go far this session.
In the last 20 years, there's been one execution and I think 6 exonerations.
Cecilia Capel is the executive director of the Louisiana Capital Appeals Project and led a team of attorneys to submit the requests.
The people on our death row are not there because these are the worst of the worst crimes. They're there because they are poor, Black, young, mentally ill, or intellectually disabled. This is not a class of people that deserves to be put to death.
But the thought of the governor even considering this request has Wayne Gazzardo appalled.
Me and my wife hadn't slept in 2 days, but we do this all the time, man. But this time is for all the marbles.
In 1995, Todd Wessinger shot 3 people inside the Callender's restaurant in Baton Rouge, including Gazzardo's daughter, Stephanie. He was sentenced to death in 1997, but is still on death row, even after constant appeals. Gazzardo believes he needs to stay there.
Till the day I die, or the day my wife dies, we'll fight it until the end. I mean, there ain't no two ways about it. He's remorseful.
The request is also baffling some longtime well-known prosecutors who put some of these criminals on death row, like former First Assistant DA John Sinkfield, who said, quote, "The outcomes should be left to the courts. These secondary victims have been engaged in years of court proceedings, and it would absolutely destroy some of these family members for the persons convicted of murdering their loved ones to be just arbitrarily released from the death penalty."
But these applications have to be individually scrutinized and judged, and I don't act on any of them unless and until the requisite vote of the Pardon Board happens.